They mocked his suit, laughed at his seat, called him baggage with legs while pretending to fix the tray table in front of him. A flight attendant wiped the armrest after he touched it, then turned to the row behind him and said, loud enough to land like a slap, "Premium service isn't for everyone." No one stopped her. No one even blinked. The man, a poised, sharply dressed black passenger, hadn't said a single word. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask for special treatment. All he did was sit down in the seat he paid for. And that was enough to turn an entire cabin against him. This wasn't discomfort. This was targeted, coordinated shame, served at cruising altitude with polished cutlery and empty grins. But here's the part no one saw coming. The very man they tried to erase, the man they pushed to the back of the plane like he was dirt on marble, he didn't come to fly. He came to watch. And when the wheels touch the ground, the truth will hit harder than turbulence. If you're here for stories that don't flinch, subscribe now. Hit the like. Tell us in the comments what moment made you stop, and where in the world you're watching from. You're about to see what happens when quiet dignity meets public exposure. This flight's just getting started. Orion stepped into first class with quiet composure, the kind that didn't announce itself but settled in like it belonged. The light above seat 2A reflected softly off the matte finish of the overhead bins, and for a moment, the cabin was silent save for the faint whir of the air system. Then came the shift. A subtle drop in warmth, an unspoken jolt of electricity that trailed behind him. 3 flight attendants, stationed along the front galley, turned almost in sync. Their gazes tracked him, not with welcome, but with inspection. One of them, a redhead with a regulation-perfect bun and a nameplate that read Leslie, stepped forward. Without a word, she produced a damp cloth and began wiping down the seat where Orion had just placed his boarding pass and briefcase. Her face neutral, but her movements sharp. She didn't acknowledge him, didn't offer the courtesy of pretending this was standard procedure. She was scrubbing his presence out of the leather. Behind her, another attendant leaned in to whisper to her colleague, not quietly enough. She nodded toward Orion's suit, well cut but conservative, and said, with a smirk curling one side of her mouth, "Rental? Looks like something from a hotel banquet rack." The other chuckled, barely stifling it with a cough as a nearby couple caught the comment. The man beside Orion glanced up briefly, then turned his head, expression unreadable. No one said anything. They didn't need to. The atmosphere said it all. Orion had paid for this seat, for this class, for this comfort. But every glance told him he was a question mark that didn't belong on the answer sheet. As Orion slid into his seat, he took his time. Not out of slowness, but precision. Every gesture controlled. He placed his bag under the seat ahead. He adjusted the lapel of his jacket. He folded his coat over the back of a chair, watching the movement of the flight crew with peripheral awareness. They watched him too, not in admiration, in judgment. The silence around his row wasn't empty. It was heavy, loud in its absence of welcome. Leslie returned moments later, leaned in with the practiced courtesy of a professional, and asked for his ticket again. He handed it over. She checked it, pretending to study the seat number as if searching for a flaw in the paper itself, then handed it back with a stiff nod. "Very well," she muttered, and left without further comment. Not a greeting, not a thank you, not even a standard beverage offer. The man in 1B, a tan-skinned hedge fund type with tortoiseshell frames and an Hermes tie, tilted his head toward Orion and said under his breath, "Don't worry. Some people just need time to adjust." It was said without irony, as if Orion had crashed a private party. The jab was neither loud nor secret, perfectly pitched for plausible deniability. Orion said nothing. He had learned long ago that responding only gave them more to push against. He looked out the window, saw the maintenance crew securing cargo, and tried to breathe past the tightness rising slowly in his chest. A different attendant came down the aisle offering pre-flight champagne. She reached the row before his, then the one after his, skipping his seat like it didn't exist. Orion caught her eye as she passed, but she looked through him, adjusting the tray like he was an obstruction rather than a guest. The couple across the aisle, both in their 60s, all pearls and press collars, stared openly. When Orion met their eyes, the woman blinked slowly and turned her head without a word, lips pursed in disapproval. 10 minutes before takeoff, the captain's voice echoed over the intercom. A calm greeting, a smooth assurance. First class hummed with quiet murmurs. Tablets flipped open, newspapers unfolded. But around Orion, there was only a shell of space that no one stepped into. He reached for the magazine in the seat pocket. Pages were torn, coffee stain on the back cover. He sat motionless, eyes forward, as though refusing to yield an inch of himself to what was unfolding around him. A man across the aisle, a tall, broad-chested passenger with a high-gloss haircut and an air of practiced arrogance, leaned toward his travel companion, pointed at Orion, and laughed. The words that followed were low, but not low enough to go unheard. "Looks like the valet got lost and found a seat," he said with a smirk, his voice laced with mockery. The companion chuckled, nudging his elbow. "Should have brought the car too." Their laughter lingered in the space like cheap cologne, aggressive, clinging. Orion felt it, but didn't turn. He didn't need to. Their intent landed squarely. Moments later, one of the attendants returned down the aisle, holding a stack of blankets, folded with the precision of military corners. She distributed them row by row with a poised smile and lowered posture, until she reached Orion. There, her rhythm shifted. She didn't offer the blanket. She dropped it, let it fall into his lap like a forgotten rag. No eye contact, no acknowledgement, just motion and exit. Orion blinked once, then placed the blanket neatly back onto the armrest. The move had not gone unnoticed. Two passengers seated diagonally in front, an elderly couple draped in designer travelwear, glanced at each other with raised eyebrows and turned away, as if witnessing something they'd rather pretend didn't happen. A voice from behind broke the quiet. The man from earlier, now emboldened, spoke just loud enough to carry forward. "Some folks just don't get it, do they? They dress it up, but it's still a flea market underneath." More laughter. Cruder this time. More certain. Orion's stomach coiled, not from surprise, but from the sheer weight of restraint it took to stay still. He had been insulted before. He had been underestimated, misread, mislabeled. But there was something different about the way this was being allowed to fester, to grow roots in silence. The captain made his pre-flight welcome, and the plane slowly began to taxi. But inside that cabin, the tension grew thicker with every foot of asphalt passed beneath them. Another attendant arrived, holding a silver tray with pre-selected in-flight menus. She handed them out with care, using both hands. To everyone except Orion. For him, she extended one hand low and fast, as if tossing an envelope across a desk. He caught it midair without flinching. "Thank you," he said evenly. The woman blinked, startled by the unexpected calm, then walked away without a word. As the aircraft accelerated for takeoff, Orion closed his eyes, not to sleep, not to escape, but to gather himself. He counted the seconds between turbulence and silence. He focused on the rhythm of engines and the slight shift of pressure in his chest. Flying was not foreign to him. He had been on dozens of flights, conferences, negotiations. He had been upgraded before, paid more than anyone on the manifest, led panels, signed mergers from the air. But never had he been made to feel like this much of an anomaly. 20 minutes into the flight, meal service began. The aroma of warm garlic bread and braised beef filled the cabin. The flight attendants moved efficiently. Plates arrived with elegant silver covers. White napkins were tucked into laps with casual grace. But when the tray reached Orion's row, the attendant paused. Her tone changed. "I'm sorry, we're out of the fillet." No explanation. No offer of alternative. Just out. She handed him a smaller, less appealing dish, cold pasta, overcooked and clumped together. The kind of meal not even served in economy, unless all options had run out. He looked at it, then back up at her. She stared straight past him. The message was not just in the words. It was in the choice. When the dessert cart came, they skipped him entirely, rolled past like he wasn't there. When he pressed the call button, it blinked once, then turned off without response. A child behind him spilled orange juice, and the mother turned to apologize, to the row ahead, not to Orion. A businessman asked the attendant for a newspaper and gestured at Orion. "You might want to get that picked up too." She nodded, laughed, didn't bother correcting him. All the while, Orion said nothing. He sat stone still in a whirlwind of micro-assaults, each one shaped to slice without breaking the skin. He ate nothing, drank nothing. The champagne from boarding hour still sat untouched at his side table, slowly warming into syrupy stillness. And unmistakable, his throat dry, Orion reached toward the overhead button and pressed it once. The chime sounded soft but crisp, registering clearly in the subdued air. He waited. The button glowed amber against the darkened panel. Seconds passed, then minutes. No one came. Across the aisle, a young woman requested tea and received it within moments, her attendant kneeling to pour it with a linen napkin placed beneath the saucer. Orion pressed the button again, this time with the patience of someone testing the edge of something he could not yet name. Again, no response. The light flickered once, then dimmed. Reset from the console. He sat back, spine tall against the seat, and took a long breath through his nose. A few rows ahead, two attendants chatted quietly near the galley curtain. One of them, Leslie, the same who had dropped the blanket earlier, leaned out just enough for her voice to carry. "Some people think a nice suit makes them invisible." The other giggled, glanced back at Orion, then whispered something that made Leslie cover her mouth and stifle a laugh. Orion didn't move, but he heard. Every syllable landed like a deliberate drop of ink across a white page. Finally, he stood, walked down the narrow aisle toward the galley. The low lights painted shadows across his face, but his expression held, composed, quietly firm. "Excuse me," he said, keeping his voice level. "I've requested water twice." Leslie turned as if surprised. "We're very busy, sir. Perhaps you can be patient like everyone else." Her tone dripped with practiced sweetness, but her eyes said otherwise. "This is first class," he replied simply, "and I made a simple request." Leslie's smile thinned. "Yes, and first-class service is for guests who actually belong here." The words were a scalpel, soft in sound, precise in injury. Before Orion could respond, she turned on her heel and disappeared behind the service curtain. A moment later, a different figure emerged, not a flight attendant, but one of the ground support staff who occasionally joined long-haul flights. The man was older, shorter, his uniform without wings or stripes. His hands were calloused. He said nothing, didn't make eye contact, and carried a plastic cup in one hand. No lemon, no glass stem, not even ice. He placed the cup onto Orion's tray table without a word and walked away. Orion stared at it. The cup fogged slightly at the edges, thin and disposable. Surrounded by wine glasses and crystal tumblers, it stood out like an insult. A plastic reminder of status redefined midair. He didn't drink it. Instead, he leaned back and observed. He began to count. 12 passengers ahead of him. 11 had been greeted with names. 10 had been served meals with menus, with choices. He had received none. Another half hour passed. The attendant from earlier returned, not to speak to him, but to check on the passenger next to him, a middle-aged man in a pinstripe suit watching a silent film. She poured his bourbon, laughed at his joke, then turned. Her tray bumped Orion's elbow. No apology, no acknowledgement. She moved to the next row. When she reached a man in athletic wear and headphones, she smiled broadly. "Would you like more champagne, Mr. Ellison?" Orion caught the name, noted it. Mr. Ellison declined. She nodded, adjusted his blanket, and then whispered, "If you need anything, just let me know. We'll take care of you." Those 5 words struck Orion with a fresh awareness, not of discomfort, but of exclusion. The message had been subtle before, but now it rang clear. You are not to be seen. You are not to be heard. You are not to be cared for. You are here, but you are alone. And it wasn't just the crew. Passengers, too, had begun their own soft ostracism. No one made small talk. No one made eye contact. A woman across the aisle clutched her purse tighter when he adjusted his seat. A man beside him shifted away when Orion's arm brushed his during turbulence. When he went to use the lavatory, the door was mysteriously locked. For 10 minutes. When it opened, no one had been inside. Returning to his seat, Orion found his pillow gone, his blanket folded and removed. When he asked why, Leslie responded briskly from 2 rows down, "We had to reallocate some amenities. Supply imbalance." The lie was so thin it might as well have been transparent. By now, Orion had stopped looking for fairness. He was watching for patterns, mapping behaviors. His mind, trained by years of executive strategy and boardroom diplomacy, cataloged each slight like bullet points in a briefing. Not for revenge, not for confrontation, for clarity. Because clarity in the right hands was more dangerous than rage. He could feel it in the glances that didn't meet his, the conversations that paused as he passed, the slight lean of shoulders away from his direction, as though his presence carried a scent or a weight they could not tolerate. The plastic cup, still untouched, sat like a stain on the pristine surface of his tray table, its meaning growing heavier with time. 37 minutes into the flight, the curtain at the front of the cabin rustled sharply. A tall man in a navy suit stepped through. He moved with stiff precision, the kind of posture trained by corporate ladders, not turbulence. His lapel bore the insignia of in-flight operations, a badge of seniority, authority, or, perhaps, selective enforcement. He scanned the cabin, eyes locking on Orion with no hesitation. His tone was pleasant, but his volume unnecessarily loud. "Mr. Belgrave, I'm with the operations team. May I speak with you for a moment?" Passengers nearby stirred, their attention now drawn toward the conversation. Orion looked up, jaw tense but voice even. "Of course." The man leaned in, lowered his tone just enough to sound confidential, without offering respect. "There's been an internal error regarding seat assignments. It appears your ticket was flagged incorrectly." He didn't pause for a response. "I'm going to ask you to relocate to another seat we've arranged in the main cabin. It's still a window, extra legroom." He said it as if describing an upgrade. Orion didn't blink. "This is the seat I booked weeks ago, paid in full." The man nodded mechanically. "Yes, well, sometimes systems misread. These things happen." He smiled, but it was a smile forged from protocol, not humanity. "We hope you understand. These accommodations are very specific, and not all are suited for any passenger." The pause before any hung like smoke in the air. Orion's silence was sharper than any rebuttal. The man continued, still loud, still performative. "We strive to ensure everyone's comfort, and sometimes that means repositioning travelers based on unforeseen requirements. It's nothing personal." But it was. Everyone knew it. No one said it. As the man gestured toward the aisle, a new voice chimed in. An older woman, white-haired, pearl earrings, the elegance of inherited wealth etched into her posture, raised her hand as if in a salon. "Excuse me," she called. "I believe this gentleman used that armrest." Her voice was measured but brittle with disdain. "Could someone kindly sanitize it?" Her gaze never landed on Orion. She spoke of him as if he were a condition, a risk, an inconvenience. A young attendant rushed over with a sanitary wipe and began scrubbing the armrest with unnecessary fervor, glancing once at Orion with a flash of guilt, then quickly looking away. The woman offered a tight smile and settled back into her seat, adjusting her scarf as if shielding herself from contagion. Orion slowly stood. The cabin had gone quiet. Even the dull clink of glassware paused as eyes followed his movement. The man in the suit stepped aside, gesturing toward the rear. Orion gathered his carry-on, every motion deliberate. He didn't speak, but his silence said more than any protest could. As he stepped into the aisle, the air shifted again. The old man across from him let out a soft breath, like relief. Someone coughed but didn't cover their mouth. A young girl peeked over the seat divider, eyes wide and confused, but her mother pulled her back without explanation. He walked past the curtain dividing first class from business, and from business to economy. With each step, the texture of the flight changed. The leather gave way to cloth, the wide space to narrow elbows, the silence to the low murmur of mass transit. When he reached his reassigned seat, he found it already occupied by a family with a toddler crying against the window. A new attendant apologized hastily and offered him another seat, this one directly in front of the lavatory. No window, no legroom, no dignity. He sat without complaint, adjusting his jacket over his lap, the tray table pressed against his knees like a restraint. The passenger beside him, a teenage boy wearing oversized headphones, stared ahead without acknowledging him. The flight attendants up front wouldn't see him now. They had succeeded. He was gone from view, no longer disrupting the aesthetic of luxury with his existence. No longer an unsightly detail in their curated sky. But what they didn't know, what none of them understood, was that they had not erased him. They had only repositioned him, shifted him into a place where the mask of civility slipped, and the truth of the system exposed itself in full light. Her name was Keely, and she hadn't intended to get involved. She wasn't looking for confrontation, but she also wasn't blind to injustice, and what she had witnessed over the past hour felt less like an airline mishap and more like an orchestrated purge. What tipped her over was the tone, a cruel blend of amusement and protocol venom dripping from the crew's mouths. She had witnessed the exchange that removed Orion, heard the insinuations, and now her instincts as an investigative freelancer quietly activated. She tapped the side of her glasses, initiating audio capture, just as the curtain at the front cracked open and two members of the crew slipped into the galley behind the cockpit. The intercom channel stayed live for internal use, but they didn't bother switching frequencies. They thought no one could hear. They were wrong. He thought dressing like a banker would get him a pass, a voice said, laughter bubbling beneath the words. Another joined in, less amused, more strategic. He's been flagged before. Same type. They come in quiet, act polite, but make people uncomfortable. The company wants less of that in premium. The first responded with a scoff. Don't worry. We're documenting. This'll go into his profile. Pattern behavior. Then, if he files anything, we've got a trail. Keely froze, her heart pulsing hard. The third voice was female, sharper, older. We handled this the right way. Visible, but contained. You saw the exec? He said straight up, make it clean. No confrontations, no write-ups. The second male voice chuckled. Yeah, he said, model case. Do it by the book, but make sure it sticks. The laugh that followed chilled her. Don't worry. The company's got our backs. This is what they hired us for. Down the aisle, a new attendant, young, quiet, fresh out of training, stood frozen near the beverage cart, her eyes widening as she accidentally overheard the same conversation through the lightly cracked service door. Her name tag read Ava. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the words had hooked into her spine, dragging her still. She had seen Orion's boarding pass earlier, marked with a black label that usually indicated high-tier loyalty. She had seen his calm, his composure. She had seen the deliberate neglect, the way the cabin shifted around him like he was radioactive. And now she heard what no passenger was meant to know, that this wasn't incompetence. It was a blueprint, a rehearsal, a silent agreement from above. Ava took one small step back, then another, until her shoulder hit the edge of the cart. She exhaled slowly, turned toward the intercom, and then stopped. Leslie, the lead flight attendant, stood at the curtain's edge with a practiced smile and cold, unreadable eyes. You're needed in coach, she said lightly, but her tone held weight. Right away. Ava hesitated. I was just restocking. Leslie leaned in, voice quiet but sharp as a wire. You're new, so I'll say this once. You speak up, you lose your pairing. You speak louder, you lose your line. And if you even think about making a report, you'll be stuck on overnight short hauls to nowhere for the next year. She smiled. Understood. Ava nodded slowly. Her voice, when it came, barely escaped her lips. Understood. Back in row 32, Orion sat still. His hands rested atop his briefcase, fingers folded with intention, head tilted slightly, as if he were dozing. But his ears were tuned. Every shift in the cabin registered with him. Every delay in service, every whisper that passed too close, every misstep rehearsed like a symphony of exclusion. He didn't know about Keely, didn't know about Ava, but what he did know was the texture of this kind of silence. It was the same silence from military briefings in hostile terrain, the same hush from boardrooms where executives planned takedowns behind smiles and manicured hands. This wasn't about him. It wasn't even personal. It was institutional. It was precise. Keely continued recording, her gaze calm but focused. She adjusted the volume, fingers brushing her lap as the voices in the galley pivoted. Now they discussed protocol, how to write the service report, which language to use if someone followed up, how to frame the removal as a proactive reallocation due to comfort discrepancy. One of them added, "Make sure it looks like a crew decision, not ops. We'll clear it with base later." Another voice, likely the same operations rep who had ousted Orion, laughed and said, "Besides, who's going to believe him? They never push past HR. We've buried worse." Keely knew this was a story now. Bigger than a viral clip. Bigger than a hashtag. This wasn't about outrage. It was about proof. Structural, repeatable proof. She flagged the audio file, encrypted it in her drive, and marked the timestamp. She would file it. She would strip out the chatter and leave only the voices that mattered. Ava, meanwhile, returned to coach, her steps hollow, her hands trembling. She stopped near the rear lavatory, out of view, and leaned against the wall. Her face burned. Her lungs felt small. She had come here to serve, to learn, to be part of something she believed in. And now, she saw the scaffolding of discrimination held not by ignorance, but by intention. It wasn't just who got denied. It was who was trained to look away. But for Orion, the worst was still unfolding beneath the surface, covert, weaponized, and designed to bruise in ways no physical blow ever could. Sometime during the third hour of flight, a flash had gone off in the distance, barely noticeable. A phone lifted subtly from a neighboring row. A photo snapped without his consent. He hadn't seen who took it. He hadn't needed to. The purpose wasn't to capture, it was to brand. By the time the plane was 30 minutes from landing, that image had circulated through a private group chat known only to the staff and select members of the crew. The caption read, "Repeat offender on board again. Claims first class. Plays the victim. Watch out." There was no context, no nuance, just a headshot of Orion leaning back in his seat with tired eyes, his face rendered into a symbol of disruption. From there, the image slipped quietly into a restricted account with a moderate following, one used for industry humor among airline insiders. The account, operated anonymously, but followed by over a dozen current employees, reposted the image with a simple line, "Guess who's back?" You'd think HR would have a blacklist by now. Within minutes, reactions poured in. Laughter in emojis. Sarcastic comments. Mentions of past flights he never took. Implications he had harassed crew. All fiction. All designed to stick. One message stood out beneath the image. They moved him to economy? Good. Maybe he'll learn. But it didn't stop there. A second post emerged minutes later, doctored from a blurry photo of Orion exiting the first-class cabin. This one captioned, "Escorted mid-flight. Aggressive behavior. Told staff he owned the airline. Classic case." No such thing had happened. He had spoken barely a dozen words the entire flight. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't gestured, hadn't moved except when told. But the photo, framed just right, made him look like he was arguing, like he was disrupting. And in this new era, the image spoke louder than truth. In the front cabin, Leslie scrolled through the comments, her lips curving into something like satisfaction. One of her colleagues leaned over her shoulder, whispering, "That's going to make training slides." They both laughed quietly. Ava, nearby, heard it but said nothing. Her heart sank as she recognized the photo. She had seen Orion from that angle. He hadn't even been looking at anyone. He had just been breathing, existing. That alone had been made into a threat. As the wheels touched down, the cabin erupted in the usual symphony of relief. Seatbelts unclicking, phones powering up, windows opening to a blur of terminal lights. But before the doors were unsealed, A message reached the captain's console. Quiet. Direct. Internal security request. Passenger flag for escort. Suspicion of disruptive conduct. The crew nodded without question. The decision had already been made. Orion remained seated, waiting like everyone else, his mind already aware of what was coming. He had seen the look in Ava's eyes when she passed his row, the hesitation, the guilt. Something had happened, something more than the neglect, and he was about to wear its consequence. Two uniformed officers stood just beyond the jet bridge as the door opened. They didn't move aggressively. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough. The head attendant gestured subtly toward the back, and they entered in sync, walking slowly down the aisle. Murmurs began before they reached him. Whispers. Gasps. Phones lifted like antennae, red dots blinking. This wasn't justice. It was theater. The officers stopped beside Orion's row. "Mr. Belgrave," one of them said, "we need you to step off the aircraft with us." "Now." He nodded. Didn't argue. Didn't resist. Just rose and collected his bag. As he stepped into the aisle, a woman 3 rows ahead tilted her phone, angling for a better shot. The sound of a shutter click punctuated the silence. Another passenger muttered. Knew it. Knew he was trouble. No one corrected her. The walk up the aisle was longer than it should have been. His legs were steady, his breath controlled. But each step felt like an accusation. The camera flashes weren't paparazzi. They were modern torches in a digital lynching. By the time he reached the threshold of the plane, more than a dozen passengers had begun uploading clips. Each one framed differently, each one shaped by their own assumptions. Man being removed from flight. Passenger causes disruption. Security involved on Flight 236. None of them knew the truth, and none of them cared. Outside, in the tunnel, another official waited with a clipboard. He handed over a form. Orion scanned it briefly. Nothing legal, just documentation, a record, a note to say they had intervened. It would be buried in systems. Inaccessible, irrelevant, but it would be there. Another echo in the file, another shadow cast over his name. They had pushed him as far as they could. They had made their final move. Now it was his turn. He allowed the officers to guide him without resistance. He gave no explanation, answered no questions. He didn't need to. He had never intended to make a scene. He had only intended to watch, to wait, to document. Back in the terminal lounge, away from the crowds, the officers led Orion to a small holding room, empty except for a metal bench and a laminated instruction poster on the wall. A third officer entered, holding a tablet, ready to take down a statement. "We're just going to get a quick version of what happened," the man said casually, tapping the screen. "We've got some reports from the flight crew. Just need your side before we file it." Orion raised his eyes slowly. "You won't be filing anything," he said, his voice calm but firmer than before. The officer blinked, confused. "Sir." Orion reached into the inner lining of his blazer. From a hidden compartment stitched along the seam, he pulled out a matte black security case the size of a phone. He pressed his thumb to the biometric scanner on the side. A soft green pulse acknowledged the imprint. Then, a small metallic keypad unfolded from the surface. Orion entered a 10-digit code, followed by 2 additional biometric gestures: fingerprint, retinal scan. The device beeped once, and a slim ID card emerged from a hidden slot. He placed it gently on the table between them. The officer picked it up, glanced at it once, then again, his face slowly draining of color. The logo on the card was unmistakable. The sharp wings and encircled star of the International Aviation Authority, a global regulatory entity above even federal airspace governance. Beneath it, Orion's name. Title: Special Aviation Ethics Investigator. Clearance level: Class Theta. The officer looked up. His throat moved once, but no sound came. Orion continued. This operation was a live assessment. Unannounced. Tier 3 Corporate Behavior Audit. The flight, the crew, the cabin, and all recorded events will be subject to immediate review and retroactive sanction. He reached across and pulled the ID back. You may contact your supervisor. My credentials will already be in their system." The man slowly stepped back, pulling out a radio. "Control, we need verification on," he paused, then turned away to listen. Orion waited. Outside the room, the two original officers who had escorted him in began receiving transmissions on their shoulder comms. One nodded. Then the other straightened. 10 seconds later, the door opened. A man in a black suit with a silver lanyard stepped inside. "Mr. Belgrave," he said without hesitation, "we apologize for the delay. Transportation is waiting for you on the tarmac. The board has been notified." Orion stood. No change in expression. No vindication in his movements. Just resolution. He nodded once to the officer with the tablet and walked out. Down the secured hallway, a sleek black SUV idled beside the private terminal entrance. Inside sat a man in a gray suit, pale and sweating through his collar. His name was Daniel Wexler, Regional Director of Operations for the airline Orion had just audited. When the door opened and Orion stepped in, Wexler stood quickly, nearly spilling the documents in his lap. "Mr. Belgrave, no one told us you were boarding." Orion raised a hand. "I wasn't meant to be known." That was the point. Wexler swallowed. The situation on the flight was escalated unexpectedly. "I assure you, if we had known," Orion cut him off, "you would have hidden it better." "I know." He took a seat opposite, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. "But now, no one can say they weren't given a chance to act better." Wexler opened a folder with trembling hands. "We've already suspended the crew. Pending investigation. We're issuing formal apologies. The communications team is drafting statements." Orion glanced at him. "Don't bother." He tapped the side of his jacket again, sending a silent signal from his device. "The report has already been uploaded. Internal records, employee behavior, chain of command breaches, passenger mistreatment protocols. There will be no statements. There will be restructuring." As the vehicle moved across the airfield, Orion watched the terminal disappear in the side mirror. He didn't speak again. His mission had been completed. The audit was live. The evidence was sealed. The airline's parent company, an international conglomerate with subsidiaries across 5 continents, would receive the findings within the hour. And by morning, the same executives who had once signed off on policies like passenger profiling and cabin optimization by image category would be in emergency sessions, scrambling to rewrite what couldn't be undone. The digital traces had been scrubbed. The audio from Keely's device already filed through secure legal channels. Ava's quiet email to HR, anonymous but laced with timestamps, had gone to the right hands. Everything was in motion. Waiting in the glass-walled boardroom were 11 individuals, the senior executive team, dressed in shades of power, panic, and performative calm. Their suits were pressed, their smiles rehearsed, but every eye in the room held the same flicker of dread. The night had not been kind. Between midnight and sunrise, a chain reaction had shattered the surface of the airline's image. What started as a private disciplinary review had evolved into a continent-spanning firestorm. 3 internal whistleblowers, galvanized by Keely's recording and Ava's anonymous logs, came forward with separate testimonies detailing targeted mistreatment of minority passengers, system flags based on visual markers, and company-wide culture tolerating coded language and covert exclusion. With every new piece of evidence, the public trust corroded faster. But it was the leaks that detonated the truth into the global narrative. The first wave came from an anonymous aviation oversight blog that published a 3-minute audio clip titled, "He Was Never Meant to Fly." It featured the flight crew's private discussion, captured during Orion's removal. Every insult, every tactical manipulation, every calculated move to humiliate him. The recording made its way to national networks within the hour. The second wave arrived on social media, where 2 passengers who had independently recorded moments of the flight, one in first class, the other during Orion's escort down the aisle, shared the full, unedited footage. These were not the viral clips previously framed to make him look disruptive. These were raw, real. They showed a man sitting in silence, a man treated like an intruder, A man removed without protest. And they showed faces, crew members laughing, passengers whispering, and most damning of all, the deliberate inaction of supervisors who let it all happen. By the time dawn broke, over 50 media outlets had begun running features titled, "Who is Orion Belgrave?" Reporters dug into public records and found very little. No interviews, no scandals, no LinkedIn page. Only one corporate profile buried on an encrypted web domain reserved for aviation compliance regulators. That profile listed him as Senior Investigator, Ethics Enforcement Division, International Aviation Authority. That changed everything. Now, seated at the head of the boardroom, Orion faced the architects of the culture he had exposed. He didn't shout. He didn't gloat. He simply laid out the data. Violations across 13 routes. Repeat complaints buried or rerouted. A pattern of forced reseating based on profiling criteria. And more than a dozen employees, current and former, testifying under oath in the coming inquiry. The silence in the room was profound. Then, in a voice clear and precise, Orion announced the decision that would rewire the industry. Effective immediately, he said, Velron Aviation's executive board is dissolved. You will be placed on administrative leave pending final review. A temporary ethics committee will assume control of operational oversight. Compensation audits will be reversed, and public statements will be issued within the hour. No one moved. A few opened their mouths to argue, but Orion continued, calm as a judge handing down a sentence. This wasn't about one flight. It wasn't about one crew. It was about a system that told itself a lie so often, it started mistaking it for policy. At exactly 9 a.m., Orion stepped onto the press podium outside Velron's headquarters, facing a sea of cameras and microphones. Media from across the globe crowded the courtyard. Flanking him were representatives from the IAA, human rights observers, and two of the whistleblowers, faces now known, voices finally heard. The statement he read was brief, unapologetic. What happened aboard Flight 236 was not an isolated incident. It was the consequence of unchecked culture. That culture ends today. Immediate steps have been taken. There will be transparency. There will be accountability. And for those who watched in silence, those days are over too. Reporters shouted questions. Will the airline be sued? What about the employees involved? How far up did this go? Orion answered only one. It went all the way up, he said. And it stops here. Behind the scenes, the public relations arm of Velron scrambled to catch up. A pre-written apology, once considered optional, was now scrubbed, rewritten, and re-released under the pressure of international scrutiny. It was issued by the acting interim director, appointed just hours earlier by emergency vote. It read, "We acknowledge the events of Flight 236 with the gravity they demand. We have failed our passengers. We have failed our values. And we are committed to rebuilding trust under the supervision of independent oversight." But the damage was done. Major investors paused funding. Code-share partners suspended affiliations. One major credit card travel program removed the airline from its elite tier benefits. For the first time in its history, Velron stock halted trade mid-session, citing volatility due to regulatory events. In a private interview recorded later that week, Keely, the passenger who captured the audio, was asked what made her act. Her answer was simple: because he didn't scream. He didn't fight, and they counted on that. Ava, in a separate statement to IAA investigators, said, "It wasn't one moment. It was the whole thing. The way we're trained to smile at some passengers and not others. I just couldn't unsee it anymore." At the center of that storm stood Veronica Hastings, the lead flight attendant from Flight 236. For 15 years, she had served with efficiency and pride, lauded by some passengers for her strict adherence to order, quietly warned about by others for her coded coldness. On the morning following the press conference, she walked into the crew center expecting a meeting. Instead, she was met by a security escort and a termination letter signed by Velron's interim ethics officer. It cited violation of passenger rights, failure to report misconduct, and participation in discriminatory behavior. She didn't argue. She couldn't. The footage was public. The audio was damning. Her words, once whispered in private, now echoed across thousands of phones and screens. As she left the building, her name had already been leaked. A clip of her on the flight, caught mid-smirk as Orion was moved to economy, was looped on news broadcasts with commentary that cut deeper than any verdict. She didn't just ignore the man. She enjoyed it. Within hours, her social media accounts were flooded, some with threats, many with disappointment, but most with a haunting consistency. "We see you now." Veronica tried to issue a statement through a lawyer, claiming miscommunication, lack of intent, misunderstanding of directives. But the statement, released just past noon, was immediately dismantled by a wave of receipts, passengers who had previously flown with her and shared eerily similar stories. "She didn't like my tone. She refused to serve me coffee, said I didn't look the part. She once asked if I was lost in business class." No one was listening to her defense, because no one needed to. By 2 p.m., her name had been removed from the airline's employee registry. By 4 p.m., she was trending globally. By nightfall, she couldn't walk into a grocery store without whispers trailing behind. In private, Veronica broke down. The silence she once used to control cabins now turned against her. In interviews, former colleagues admitted complicity, claiming pressure to conform, fear of speaking up. Some said she led by intimidation. Others said they just didn't want to get on her bad side. But none of them protected her now. Across the executive boardrooms of Valron's global offices, another disaster unfolded: financial devastation. The company's stock began to drop the moment Orion's press conference aired. It was a slow decline at first, then a full-scale collapse. Analysts, already wary of Valron's increasing consumer complaints, saw the investigation as the tipping point. Institutional investors fled. Travel partners terminated agreements. Corporate clients withdrew volume bookings. By market close, the company had lost $2.3 billion in value, its worst single-day loss in history. At the Nasdaq bell, anchors repeated the figure with disbelief. A diversity scandal has cost Valron over $2 billion in equity. Board members who had once backed Orion's removal strategy now scrambled to distance themselves. The new acting director issued a second statement. "This is not a media crisis. This is a failure of culture. And culture is built by people. That is what we are changing." But public forgiveness came slow, and Wall Street didn't wait for healing. Credit ratings dipped. Regulatory inquiries mounted. The Department of Transportation announced a surprise inspection into all employee training protocols. International airports began auditing partner lounges and services connected to Valron-branded programs. Even unrelated companies issued statements of disapproval, anxious to separate their names from the sinking brand. And while the business hemorrhaged value, those responsible faced legal exposure. Class action lawsuits were filed by passengers affected by discriminatory practices. Civil rights organizations offered free legal counsel. Orion, though not the plaintiff in any of them, was requested as a witness. He declined interviews but submitted full transcripts of his evidence. He knew the courtrooms weren't for him. They were for the system that made silence profitable. Still, his presence loomed large. Journalists referred to his case as the Belgrave precedent, a term already used in university ethics courses and executive seminars. Employees who had remained silent faced new scrutiny. Some issued apologies. Some resigned. Some denied everything. But none escaped unscathed. At airports, protesters gathered with signs. "Dignity is not a privilege." Who else got reassigned? At one location, a mural appeared overnight. Orion's silhouette surrounded by names of unknown victims from other flights. Below it, 3 words: "We saw. We remember." 12 months had passed since the flight that exposed an entire system. The world moved quickly after impact. Yet beneath the noise of trending stories and fading hashtags, something quieter and more enduring took shape. Not every redemption story made headlines. Not every reckoning ended in ruin. But in the slow turning of seasons, growth began to bloom where pride had once taken root. Veronica Hastings had disappeared from the public eye in the weeks following her termination. After the interview failed, after her name became a byword for cruelty behind a stewardess's smile, she moved back to her hometown in South Carolina. She lived alone. The house belonged to her mother. For months, she didn't speak. Not to press. Not to former colleagues. Not even to herself, if silence could be counted that way. But each morning, she read the same letter, printed in black ink, folded 3 times, the corners softened by repetition. It wasn't a legal notice. It wasn't hate mail. It was a single-page statement issued by Orion Belgrave the day after the lawsuit settled. It read simply, "What happened to me was not new, but what happens next can be." Beneath that line, in small script, were 12 names. The names of every staff member on board Flight 236. No accusations, no commentary, just acknowledgement, just record. The letter haunted Veronica, not because it condemned her, but because it didn't. It expected her to decide what kind of story she would live going forward. For the first time in her life, no uniform, no title, no policy could tell her who she was. And so she began to write. 1 page, then 2. Drafts full of excuses, redacted memories, half-truths she had told herself for years. It took 5 weeks before she threw them all away and started again. The final version began with the words, "I was wrong." She mailed it by hand. No press team. No broadcast. Just a letter addressed to the Civil Rights Reconciliation Council, where she had applied, quietly, without fanfare, as a volunteer. They called her back within 3 days. Now a year later, she spent her mornings organizing community workshops in rural counties where systemic exclusion was still law by another name. She didn't speak much about the airline. When asked, she simply said, "That was another life. I'm building a better one now." She didn't ask for forgiveness. She earned presence. And presence, when truly owned, needed no applause. Elsewhere in Atlanta, another life transformed in the shadows of the storm. Marcus Drayson, the junior flight attendant who had once laughed along with the crew during Orion's silent exile, had taken a leave of absence after the inquiry. No one forced him. No articles named him. But guilt has a way of making a man move. He enrolled in night courses, racial equity training, corporate ethics, and public policy. His old crew mates mocked him quietly, called it overcompensation. He didn't answer. At the end of course, he applied for a diversity ambassador role within Velron's restructured HR division. This time, when he stood before the panel, he said what he hadn't said to Orion on that flight. "I saw it. I knew it. I did nothing. That won't happen again." They gave him the job. And then there was Ava, the quiet attendant who had witnessed everything from behind the beverage cart and said nothing that day. But she hadn't forgotten. It was Ava who sent the anonymous log that reached the IAA. It was Ava who first said to Keeley, "If I give you names, will you protect me?" And it was Ava who stood at the ceremony when Velron launched the Sky Equity program, a complete overhaul of hiring, training, and cabin conduct, with her name engraved as the first contributing advisor. She never gave speeches. She didn't want recognition. But she smiled when parents came to her sessions and said, "My daughter wants to be a flight attendant now. I used to be afraid." That was enough. And Orion? He returned to his work, not for revenge, not for celebration, but for purpose. He declined interviews. He rejected book deals. He turned down a documentary offer from a streaming platform that wanted to dramatize the flight. "I'm not a character," he told them. "I'm a reminder." He continued traveling, quietly, anonymously, but always in the aisle seat now. Always with his name listed like anyone else's. Sometimes he was recognized. Mostly he wasn't. That's how he preferred it. He wasn't there to be noticed. He was there to notice. And change followed him like a shadow, finally aligned with its owner. The scholarship fund came quietly, no logo, no gala. Just a check written in the name of a young boy who wanted to study aviation. The son of Ava. The boy didn't know who Orion was, only that someone believed he should fly. His mother never said more than, "A good man saw something in you." That boy now wore a pin on his backpack shaped like wings. He would be the first in his school to study aerospace engineering. He would be the first in his family to fly a plane. The legacy would not be what happened on Flight 236. The legacy would be what came after. Because the end of injustice isn't a verdict. It's what we build when no one's looking. The end. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, don't forget to like and subscribe for more narratives that challenge, reveal, and transform. We'd love to hear from you. Which moment hit the hardest for you? Was it the silence, the fall, or the redemption? And tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters.